Good evening. I'm Darnell Hunt, Dean of Social Sciences at UCLA. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our first Dean's Salon of 2021-22 academic year, Kal Penn on Life and Diversity in Hollywood. For those of you who follow our work in the social sciences here at UCLA, you know that we produce an annual study of diversity in Hollywood, known as the Hollywood Diversity Report. Could we get slide 1, please? We just released our latest report on television, you see here, a few weeks ago on October 26th. This evening, I'm so pleased to be in conversation with actor, show creator, political operative, and UCLA alum Kal Penn, whose amazing career embodies many of the issues we explore in the report. He and I will spend about an hour talking before we open things up to the audience for questions. The Q&A button is now active. If you wish to submit a question for Kal, please click the button at the bottom of your screen and we'll begin selecting audience questions around 6 p.m. Okay, it's my pleasure now to welcome Kal. Kal, welcome back to UCLA, if only virtually.
I know, thanks, Darnell. I appreciate it, and thanks to everybody for having me. I wish I was in the quad that's behind me right now, but one day soon, I hope.
So one day soon, I think we'll be making these things in person at some point. Well, first of all, I want to congratulate you on your new memoir, You Can't Be Serious. Can we see slide 2? Now, I just finished reading the memoir. It's a fascinating account of your journey from a kid of Indian immigrants growing up in New Jersey to Hollywood and to the halls of power in Washington. Talk to me though about the title, You Can't Be Serious. Where does that come from?
So first of all, thank you. This book was a real labor of love. I have one next to me since we're doing an event that touches on the book. The title comes from the fact that I've played both, a stoner and done comedies primarily in my acting career, and then had the chance to also serve our country at the White House. And through each of those steps, particularly like you mentioned, as the son of immigrants, the idea of becoming an actor is really not why my parents moved to America. The idea that you must be joking, you can't be serious, the double entendre also being when I went to go work in Washington after a career mostly in comedy, will anybody take you seriously? So wanted a title that was a fun double entendre on both of those things, and also kind of a hat tip to the very Bruin idea that the world isn't made up of mutually exclusive choices necessarily. Things aren't binary, and the stuff gets complex.
Yeah, that's very very well said. You can take down the slide now. So how long did this take? I mean, you cover a long period of time in the book. I mean, in the detail, it's pretty amazing. I mean, I was thinking like, gee, if I wrote my own memoir, would I remember all that? I mean, how did you uncover all of those memories?
Thank you. It took me just about 4.5 years to put this together. The initial idea for the book actually was almost 10 years ago. The day that I was leaving the White House, my manager, my acting manager, called me. He's the only manager I've had. I describe him in the book, which actually is pretty accurate. I describe him as every character from the TV show Entourage in person. So he's a completely ridiculous person, but also, he's a lion. He's got a heart of gold. He called while I was still living in DC, transitioning back to acting before I'd moved back to LA. And he said, you should write a book. And I said, well, I don't really have a story to tell. What would the book be about? He said, well, listen, man, nobody has gone from working in entertainment to working in politics. And I'm on the phone with him, and I just said, literally, the governor's name is Arnold Schwarzenegger. And he was like, okay, good point. But then we started a conversation about, why he was sort of pushing for a book. And I just said, look, the reason that I decided to take a sabbatical from acting to work in public service was not to write a book about it. So just please leave that alone. And a couple of years went by, probably another 3 or 4 years went by. And I kind of realized, I think I did have a story to tell, and I wanted to tell it for the 20-year-old version of me, the kid who was living in Reber Hall, trying to go on auditions, trying to navigate the entertainment industry as a young man of color. And I also wanted to write it for the person who now, today, well into adulthood, might be told that they're crazy for taking that extra class or following that passion or changing a career midway through. That craziness was something that I'm really familiar with. And I think, frankly, hopefully coming out of this pandemic, a lot of people are reanalyzing their jobs, what they're doing with their lives. So it seemed like the right time to put it together. I am very thankful that you said what you said about the memories, because fact checking the book took months and months, and it was really important to me, especially since I was sharing some pretty intimate stories about things like race or racism in Hollywood, and wanting to make sure that they were put in the right context of how systems can and do change. It was a lot of phone calls to people I hadn't spoken to in years, and wanting to make sure I didn't feed them the, hey, this is what I remember from that audition. That happened, right? Like instead of that, it was just, hey, do you remember in May of 1999, I saw you in this audition room. What do you remember about that day? So it was a lot of conversations that then went into feeding some of the intimacy of these stories.
Yeah, one thing I really appreciate, we academics, we take footnotes very seriously. I love the way you use footnotes in the book. Can you talk a little bit about that? I mean, they're hilarious in many cases, the way you kind of hone in on certain points in your statement to kind of give the other side of the story.
Thank you. Yeah, look, as a storyteller with a comedy background, there's always a lot that you want to say, and you have limited time to say it. So the idea of an aside, or the idea of the equivalent of doing a monologue and then having just something aside to one of the characters, or to, in this case, the audience, it was important to me that the book felt like we were having a beer together. It felt like a conversation. It's why I did the audiobook myself. It's why I put those footnotes in the written version. I felt like it punched the comedy, but also, frankly, I mean, for some of the stories with when it came to Hollywood typecasting race, I wanted to make sure I told the full story and the full picture. And a lot of times that meant that there's like a paragraph of a footnote, and it's not necessarily a citation, but it's a whole background to the story that led up to kind of the meat of the chapter. Yeah. Yeah,
and we really want to get into some of those examples in a few minutes. But before I do that, so your memoir is hilarious, but it's also quite serious. And I love the descriptive names you have for many of the people you meet on your journey. Captain Moneybags, Original Ideas McGee, Sassy Producer, Facey McPainty. What inspired you to come up with those names?
So the first draft of this book, and all those, for folks who haven't read yet, all the chapters that Darnell's referring to, or all the characters rather, are from some of the Hollywood chapters where, Facey McPainty was an actor who was in the final round of an audition I did for a movie called Van Wilder, which I ended up being in. And I knew in that story that it was going to be me and another guy. We were the last two, and one of us would get the part. So the last audition was the two of us. And I couldn't figure out which other Indian American performer I was going to be auditioning opposite. And it was the role of an exchange student from India. I walk into the audition, and it was a white dude in brown face. And that was very common in those days. I mean, to be fair, it's not uncommon today. Aladdin just did it with their background performers last year. And so instead of, the whole point of the book is not to necessarily call out individuals. I do think there's a role for that, certainly at certain times. But I didn't want to almost give people that wind in their sails. And I thought, if the whole point of telling this story is how performers of color make certain choices and sacrifices along the way to hopefully continue to move the industry in the right direction, I didn't want to get distracted with their actual names. Plus, just calling him Facey McPainty is, to me, A, funnier, B, takes the bite out of what that guy was doing. And in the book, I describe it as, your beef is not often with other actors, even despite the fact that the guy showed up in brownface. And I was more fascinated than anything at the time. And there I was, I graduated from UCLA 2 years before. I'm sitting in that audition, and the whole time just thinking, so did this dude paint his face before he left the apartment? Did he do it in the car? Did he come early and do it in the bathroom? Did somebody tell him to do it? So all of those characters and those names have been changed, not just to protect the guilty, but really to focus on what I wanted those stories to focus on, which is the way things were, sometimes the way things are, and how we can chip away at those systems to make things better.
Yeah, no, it's very effective, particularly when you come back to them, later in the memoir. I mean, it really does kind of tie the knot very nicely.
And by the way, not none of this is a big secret. Anybody with IMDb in an extra 10 minutes can figure out who I'm talking about. I was trying to cover up any of these stories.
Trace your credits, and look who's associated with the projects, right? Yeah, I did not do that. Anyway, can we get slide 3, please? So I love the film Mississippi Masala. I remember when it came out, and I remember being excited about seeing it. And your memoir kind of provides a touching account of the role the film played in your development as an actor. Can you share this with the audience?
Absolutely. Mississippi Masala was the first film I remember seeing that had people who looked like me, who weren't cartoon characters and weren't reductionist stereotypes. So I saw this film with my parents and my cousin in the theater. I must have been 14 years old, 13 or 14 years old. And it's oftentimes tough to explain to friends who have always grown up seeing characters who look like them on screen what it feels like when you don't. And this movie kind of showed me, it really made me realize what that was. And it was that, this film is, the South Asian characters in particular, they're incredibly flawed, as they should be. I mean, that's what makes characters human, right? And they have financial problems, they fall in love, they have sex, they make mistakes. I had not seen that. And when I saw this film, it made me say, maybe this is something that I can do as well. Maybe I can be the kind of storyteller that I was inspired by when I saw this film. And Mira Nair has been, she's now a dear friend, but has been a role model through my career, somebody who I could kind of point to from a really young age and say, wow, she's doing it. I want to follow in her footsteps.
In fact, you went on to do a film with her, didn't you?
I did wind up doing a film with her. And in fact, even before that, I'm looking at Royce Hall over your shoulder, and I'm remembering how must have been my third year on campus. I saw a flyer that said that Mira was speaking, and she was speaking in the film building, and I waited in line for hours with the hopes that I could snag a good seat and hand her my headshot and resume and ask a really smart question. This is not, by the way, how I ended up getting cast in her film. But even seeing her speak on campus was a real motivating factor at a time when I didn't really feel that much love from the South Asian community or from my peers in the arts. And then it wasn't for years and years later. I mean, the way that I tell the story in the book is absolutely true. I'm jumping around a lot here, but that experience auditioning against the guy in Brownface for a movie called Van Wilder, Ryan Reynolds was the lead in that movie. He was fantastic and very encouraging, despite what the character I played was. And had I not done that movie, I wouldn't have had the chance to do Harold and Kumar Go to White Castle. There was no shortage of brown and yellow actors to play those two title characters. Yeah. I was one of the few who had a studio credit on his resume because I had done Van Wilder. So you jump from having done Van Wilder to doing the Harold and Kumar movies. This movie, The Namesake, that Mira Nair directed, really the biggest reason that I had the chance to audition for that was that her 14-year-old son, Zoran, was a huge Harold and Kumar fan. And so really that jump from, had I been too precious about some of those early jobs, wouldn't have had the chance to do Harold and Kumar, wouldn't have had the chance to audition for The Namesake. And The Namesake was the project of which, film-wise to date, I'm the most proud. So it's quite I'm really paraphrasing, I think, a good chapter and a half on everything that went into that, but it was really meaningful to me because there were, there were such slim opportunities in those days, and they were very meaningful to me in terms of why I wanted to be an artist to begin with.
It's really funny the way things work out. Huh? Okay. Yeah, so share with the audience how you became Kal Penn and what this says about identity in Hollywood.
Yeah, when I started at UCLA, I started as a theater major, and I was a state student. I was very excited to be obviously on campus, but to be so close to the entertainment industry. And I was, it was nice to see that other students in my theater classes already had agents and already had managers, and they were going out for professional auditions on the side. And I tried really hard. Every Wednesday, I would walk down to the newsstand that still exists on Gailey and buy a Backstage West newspaper. Backstage is now all online, but you get casting notices, send your resume and sometimes an audition tape to agents for consideration for representation. And for about 2 years, nobody ever called me back. And a friend of mine who is also an actor, her name's Jenna Vanoy. She was good friends with one of my friends in the theater program. She had a huge manager. She had just come off of the TV show Blossom. She was on the show The Parkers at the time. And she said, why don't I just take your tape and your resume and headshot to my manager? He'll at least meet with you. He'll meet with you and you can talk about what are the things on your tape that you should maybe improve. Maybe he'll sign you. I don't know. But at least let me do that. And I said, that, I mean, what a treat. Thank you so much. She called me about a week later and she said, so he doesn't want to meet with you. And I'm curious how much you want to know. And, immediately I took my artist hat off and put on the business person hat. And I said, I want to know everything. I mean, I want to know everything so that I know what I can do differently on that audition tape. And she said, well, you should know two things. First of all, he said you were really good. He thought you were talented and he never says that. So I just want you to know that that's true. I was like, okay, I feel there's going to be a huge but here. And she said, yeah, but he said that somebody who looks like you is never going to work consistently enough in Hollywood for it to be worth his while. So he doesn't want to meet with you. And I kind of thought, oh, okay, so there's actually nothing that I could be doing differently on these audition tapes or in my headshot or my resume, because my barrier to entry is just what I look like. That, he just doesn't feel like I rake in enough money for him to get his commission. And that was a real eye opener because I hadn't prepared for that. I went to a public performing arts high school in New Jersey. I was at UCLA. Nobody tells you that. There's no theater class that tells you this is something that you might encounter. To be fair, every performer is told things like you're too tall, you're too short, you're too fat, too skinny, whatever it is. Those are all things that you expect. But performers of color often don't have the luxury to be too tall, too short, too fat, and too skinny. And that was my first real eye opener for that. And around the same time, my friends in the dorms were saying things like, hey, what about a screen name? And by the way, none of them were theater majors. They were all South Campus guys. And they said, what about a screen name? Whoopi Goldberg's name isn't really Whoopi Goldberg. It's Karen Johnson. Could you imagine if we went by Karen Johnson? That wouldn't be as memorable. I'm like, oh yeah, I guess I hadn't thought about that. Of course, the name's not Whoopi Goldberg. So they kept going on and giving me all these examples. And I said, well, what would my screen name be if I came up with one? And they said things like, well, what about Cal Pacino? This is not happening. Ultimately, it was the conversation extended to a 2:30 a.m. In Fatburger in Westwood. We ended up with, my first name, my legal name is Kalpen, Kalpen or Kalpen. And that had long been shortened to Cal, the way that Joseph becomes Joe. And so they said, well, what if you just split up your first name into two, don't change it legally, but throw it on your resume and see what happens. And that same weekend, I happened to be getting a new set of headshots. So I got these new headshots. I had this new flashy screen name, sent out these resumes and pictures. And a few months later, there was an agent who finally called. And I'll never know. I mentioned this in the book. There are different iterations of this story where people have written short versions of this saying, that's the only reason that Kalpen ever got a job. I'm like, well, she were that simple to be able to point to one thing. But Darnell, as you know, a lot of this stuff is complicated. I'll never know exactly what it was that made her call me. It could have been the headshot, could have been the name, could have been a combination, could have been some other third thing. But to your point, that was kind of how the screen name came about. I never changed it legally, but I certainly did put it on headshots and resumes, and it for whatever reason made a difference.
Yeah, it's a very insular industry in the sense that it's very networky, and the people who are in the positions to make decisions tend to hire people they've worked with before, that they're comfortable with, and all too often kind of look like them. So it's often hard for people to break in who don't quite, fit the mold, so to speak. And I think one of the things that I took away from your memoir is sort of all of the hurdles you had to overcome to kind of get to the point where people recognize your talent, your training, and all the things you'd accomplished over the years. Can you talk, and kind of closely associated to the other question, about something in your memoir that you call the Brown Catch-22? Explain to the audience what that is.
Yeah, I called it the Brown Catch-22. It's this idea that, and again, you can apply this to any performer, but the reason that it's a Brown Catch-22 will be obvious. You can't audition for big parts unless you have something on your resume, unless you have credits on your resume, smaller credits for smaller roles. But you can't get those smaller roles unless you have credits on your resume. And for performers of color, you can't, at least at the time, I know it's still true today to some extent, but at the time especially, the only roles that you were allowed to audition for were roles that were specifically written South Asian. And those tended to be stereotypical, either because of accent or profession or dress. And to be perfectly clear, an accent, a profession, or dress are not inherently stereotypical. It's the reductionism that tends to accompany those, right? The signifiers and the things that writers put in there. And so the only way that you can break in is by taking some of those roles so that you can, the theory was that you could then work your way up to bigger and bigger parts. The frustrating thing was early on, I would take some of those roles with the hope that that would help me build up more of those, break out of the Brown catch-22. But I found myself only getting to audition for bigger and bigger parts that were equally frustrating, reductionist, stereotypical. Eventually, it did. I was able to break out of that primarily with Harold and Kumar Go to White Castle. Although there were a couple of examples even before that. The Buffy and Angel universe. My friend Nick Cannon's movie Love Don't Cost a Thing. There were definitely opportunities before that, but generally speaking, that was the kind of cycle of what I called the Brown catch-22.
Yeah. One of the UCLA PhD students I've had the pleasure of mentoring over the years, Nancy Yoon, wrote a book called Real Inequality: Hollywood Actors and Racism. And it focuses on the dilemmas that actors of color often face in Hollywood when they're asked to play roles that they know are stereotypical. And so the examples you just used obviously point to that. You return in your memoir to multiple instances in your career where you certainly felt this pressure. Can you talk about a few of those moments and how you dealt with them?
Yeah, thank you for asking it that way, because I'm the first person to say I made the choice to do these things. Nobody forced me into it. There are plenty of actors who've made the opposite choice and who sort of threw middle fingers up in the air and walked out of auditions. And I have the utmost respect for them too. That's their journey, and that's what they thought was right for them in that moment. I do, as much as I don't name names of individuals, I do name the projects in the book, and one that really stood out in my mind was Sabrina the Teenage Witch. I don't know how much you all remember that show, but it's about a talking cat and a bunch of witches. And I got an audition shortly after I graduated for the part of a kid in a study group with Sabrina, the lead character. And I remember preparing for this audition and creating a big backstory for the character. It was only a couple of lines, but I thought, all right, this dude is from Seattle, Washington, and he likes microbrews and small batch organic coffee, likes Nirvana and Pearl Jam. So I wore a flannel to the audition, and I went in, and I felt like it went well. I was walking back to my car, and the casting director came running after me, and he said, "Hey, the producers really want you to do it again." I said, "Well, that's wonderful. What a great sign." And as we're walking back to the audition room, he says, "Just so you know, this time it's with an accent." And this was so common. I mean, almost every audition that I was going on, some version of this would happen. So I walked in and they said, "You were so funny. We want you to do it again, this time with an accent." And I said the thing that I usually would say in those days, which was, "Sure, what kind of accent would you like? I can do Scottish, British, Irish, Italian." They were never amused, and they would always kind of lean in and go, "Why don't we just stick to Indian?" And, again, that's a decision point. A lot of people would have and have certainly walked out of the audition room at that time. In my case, I kind of made that calculus of, all right, my rent's $500 a month. This job pays $750, and I want a credit on my resume. And do I want it badly enough that I'm willing to do this? And like that Van Wilder story, in a lot of cases, the waiting room was full of white guys who they were going to paint brown if they got the part. So part of me just thought, you're not allowed to have this part. This is mine. I want to get this. So I did it. And I remember in that case in particular, I did the accent they wanted. I went home, my agent called and said, "Congratulations, you booked the part." And two things happened. One, I was very conscious of the fact that I wasn't happy. My other aspiring actor friends and young actor friends, when they would book jobs, even small jobs like this, we'd go out for beers and we would celebrate. And, we would be happy that, that dream of being a storyteller and becoming an actor was launching for them. And I didn't feel that happiness because of the fact that, it was kind of reduced to a stereotype that I had prepared for this audition. And it was just at the end of the day, just kind of made into something that I wasn't excited about. So the second thing was I said to the agent, "Is there any reality in which I can get this part and play him without the accent?" And she said, "My advice to you would be to go a little early the day of the shoot and just talk to the director. Most people are not mean-spirited. They're perfectly rational. Just make your case. So I said, all right. So I went in early and I found the director by the coffee cart and I said, hey man, your show is so funny. Thank you for having me. It's, by the way, not a very funny show. It doesn't really hold up. He had to butter him up. So I buttered him up and I said, thank you for having me. The show's very funny. I was wondering if maybe I could play this part without an accent. You know, I prepared this character, had this whole backstory, and he just kind of cut me off and said, no, you're going to do the accent. It's really funny. And I said, oh, right. But, you know, I actually never grew up seeing people who looked like me on screen, who talked like me with a similar background. I thought the more interesting choice, the funnier choice would be if I could play him that way. And he said, no, obviously you're doing the accent. It's funny. That's why we hired you. And then I remember thinking, like, you know, between all of my sociology classes and every well-meaning person I've spoken to, apparently it's ignorance that causes racism. So I'm just going to have to educate this guy. So I said, look, man, I have a 10-year-old and an 11-year-old cousin, and they love your show. And that was true. They love your show. I just thought it would be amazing if my little cousins could see people on TV in a way that I never got the chance to do. It would really mean a lot to me. And I know I can nail the comedy. And he looked at me and he said, well, your little cousins should feel lucky that you're allowed to be on TV to begin with, and so should you. And he walked off. And so, you know, big realization point, it's not about ignorance, it's about power, it's about maintaining that power, it's a purposeful decision that people are making. And then my mind kind of wandered to the other shows that were on at the time, you know, Seinfeld and Friends, two shows that are actually funny, unlike Sabrina the Teenage Witch, Seinfeld especially, so well. But do you know how hard you have to try to make New York City that white? I mean, you have to try. It's a choice, you know, both for Seinfeld and for Friends. And I remember just thinking about all that going, whoa, wait a second. Is this Brown Catch-22 going to follow me everywhere? Because even at that level, I wasn't seeing anybody who looked like me. So I ended up, you know, playing the part. Obviously, again, that was my choice to stay. I could have left. I tell a couple other stories in the book about being at points where I did try to leave after a director, you know, in Son of the Mask, for example, a movie. The director waited until I got to the set to tell me that he wanted an accent, and I tried to get out of it and was threatened with a lawsuit. So had to stay and kind of do it that way. So even after the fact, even trying to remove yourself from it, there are barriers that people sort of had tried to keep me in place. But the reason I tell the Sabrina the Teenage Witch story, just to be clear, it's not a one-off. You know, that story repeated itself over and over again in a lot of different projects. And the reason that I do talk about what those projects were and what those experiences were like, it wasn't that long ago. You know, in one of the brown face references, I felt like I showed the chapter to a couple of friends and they said, when was this? And I said, you know what? It was when the song Bye 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 came out. And that song is still on my karaoke rotation. So that it wasn't that long ago. But again, the point of telling that story and all these stories is I love what I do so much. And I love the industry that I work in. And I'm so happy that it's changed over the last 20 years. It obviously, as you know, from the report that you write, it has such a long way to go, but it's come leaps and bounds in a way that I do want to celebrate and acknowledge what that progress looks like and what it was like to be part of that slow sort of pace of change. So Sabrina is just one of, unfortunately, just one of many examples, but there are also plenty of stories about triumph in there.
No, I love the Sabrina example. It's very telling. So you mentioned it before, Harold and Kumar. I mean, obviously a breakout role for you. What was it like to be a part of that project?
I mean, that was incredible. Harold and Kumar Go to White Castle. I first met the writers. I met John Hurwitz and Hayden Schlossberg at an acquaintance's birthday party. And the friend introduced us and said, my buddies wrote a script and they wanted to meet you. And I start talking to John Hurwitz. And I think one of the first things he said to me was, whoa, you don't have an Indian accent. And I was so off put by this. I said something snarky. I mean, I think I called him an asshole and said something snarky back. And he said, no, wait a second. I thought that you had an accent because I saw you in Van Wilder with Ryan Reynolds and you're very funny and it was believable. And that's what I meant. I'm actually glad you don't, because the role that I wrote is for a guy who's from New Jersey and he and his stoner buddy go on a quest for hamburgers. And it's a movie about friendship. And I was very confused because nobody ever pitched an idea to me that included Asian Americans and it was just a friendship comedy. And plus I said, I'm from New Jersey and John and Hayden Schlossberg are both also from New Jersey. So it became this instant bond. For Californians out there who may not know, New Jersey and Texas are like the two states that have this weird bravado. I don't know why Texas has it. I can tell you what New Jersey does. But so being from New Jersey is like an ethnicity, and we immediately bonded off of this idea. And I said to them, guys, you know, you're never going to sell that script the way that you just described it. But I would love to help find VCs and find, you know, grants that we could apply for to get that movie made on a micro budget, because I know Hollywood won't make it. Trust me. I've been trying to do this for 7 years, 8 years. And they said, well, we'd love to send you the script. And just so you know, we are going to sell it to a studio. That's our plan. So they sent me the script that Monday, and I read it immediately and loved it. I mean, it was to date, it's probably the funniest feature film script I'd ever read. And I called them and I said, this is incredible. You're never going to sell it. And I really want to help you make it. And he reiterated the same thing. He said, it goes out to market on Wednesday. I think by Friday they had sold it to Senator and New Line Cinema as a negative pickup, and then launched this really, really long casting process because, contrary to popular perception, there was no shortage of Asian American actors to fill those two roles. So that's what kicked off a really, really long audition process that thankfully John and I ended up getting cast in.
Now, was that the first film to feature two Asian Americans in the lead roles?
In a comedy, yeah.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Yeah.
Yeah. So it was a big deal in that sense. And, you know, there were two things. I don't know if I tell this in the book. I can't remember. But when we were filming that movie, we filmed in Toronto. And I think it was the second week when somebody who was up there, who had kind of been shuttling the tapes back and forth to LA so that the studio execs could look at two things. First of all, the only reason the movie got greenlit is there were two young executives at New Line who I believe were given one thing that they could greenlight within a certain budget a year, and they chose Harold and Kumar Go to White Castle. So that was, you know, thanks to the youthfulness and the diversity of the two of them, that happened. But the story goes, as far as I remember it, that when all the older execs were watching the first week of dailies in the screening room, a couple of them stormed out and said, why the F don't these kids have accents? And when, you know, we heard about that, we were just kind of laughing, because it's like, all right, they trusted the junior guys to greenlight this movie. They didn't even necessarily fully understand it. When the movie came out, a lot of people also forget, it really tanked at the box office. It didn't do very well. It did well in a handful of pockets around the country, mostly along the coasts. But, you know, I remember John and I and the writers and the producers all went to multiple theaters in and around the LA area on opening weekend, mostly to empty audiences. And that Monday, the feeling in Hollywood was a "see, we told you so." See, we told you that two Asian American men can't open a studio comedy. And it was a couple of months after that of a real downer, until the movie aired on HBO and then came out on DVD. And that's when people just started buying it and gifting it to each other and holding watch parties. And it wasn't just the Asian Americans. It wasn't just people of color. It wasn't just along the coasts. I mean, it was kids in Alabama and Iowa and Arkansas and Montana. And it just kind of, the idea that it was a movie about friendship, that it was a comedy that people could.
So was it just the marketing? Was it the marketing the first go around?
I think it was, I think it was the marketing. And let's be honest, it's not a great title, right? Think about it now, you're like, yeah, I know that movie. But at the time, it was not an amazing title for a movie, probably. But yeah, I would say it was the marketing and probably the way that, you know, just expecting less of your audience, you know, that it performed because you just don't think that certain types of people are necessarily going to watch it.
Yeah. Which we're going to come back to that, actually, because there's another story in your memoir that I think touches on that point. But I think this particular case speaks to the importance of having people in the executive suites who can greenlight projects, who understand the value of diversity. And in this case, that's probably the only reason why this particular film was greenlit. Okay, so you took a break from a coveted regular role on Fox's popular drama House to become a volunteer for the Obama campaign in 2008. And then you later left Hollywood altogether for a couple of years to actually work in the White House. So tell us about these decisions and what the experience was like.
Yeah, this is part of the reason why the title's called "You Can't Be Serious." None of it was planned. You know, I was on House. That was the first acting job that I had with any sort of stability. So finally, all the aunties and uncles who wanted me to be a doctor were relieved that I was at least playing one on TV. But going from that stability, Olivia Wilde was on the show with me, fantastic director and actor, and she knocked on my dressing room door one day and she said, "I have a +1 for a Barack Obama event. Do you want to come with me?" And I said, "Nah, I'm good." She said, "What are you talking about? I saw you reading his book a couple of months ago." I said, "Yeah, I read his book. I liked it. Doesn't mean I want to go and meet the guy. I assume it's a campaign event." She said, "Yeah, it's a small campaign event for about 50 artists. And the senator is going to ask us to give him a hand in Iowa to help campaign with young people and whatever it is that artists can do." And I said, "Yeah, I'm not really interested in that." After a lot of lobbying on her part and a promise of an open bar, I said, "All right, I'll come with you. I'll be your +1." And the longer version of the story is I had done a bunch of research after agreeing with her, went to an event that he was speaking at to see what he's like in front of big donors. But before going to that event with her that night, I went on his website and I thought, I'm gonna find a question that I can ask that's gonna make me sound smart, because I know the questions that people are gonna ask in a room full of artists that I also want to know the answer to, like, what's your proposal for arts education or the NEA funding or cultural diplomacy? But I don't think anybody's gonna ask a question about climate change, for example. So I'm looking on the website at Senator Obama's climate change plan, and I noticed that there's a thing in there that says he's going to invest in corn to turn into ethanol for fuel. And I had remembered, this also shows everybody what a huge nerd I am. So I remembered that a few months prior, I had read an article in Foreign Affairs, which is that big, thick magazine that fellow nerds probably also subscribe to, or if you've taken a poli-sci class, you know this. Council on Foreign Relations puts it out. I'm a subscriber, and I remember reading a thing that said that if we invest in corn-based ethanol, it could drive the price of corn up in developing countries, and people will be able to afford it far less for food. So you'll have a lot more hungry people. And I thought, that's my answer right there, or that's my question right there. So I go to this event, Obama's making the rounds, comes over to where Olivia and I are standing. And I said, "Senator, I actually have a question for you about climate change. You know, your plan is to invest in corn-based ethanol, and won't that just result in the price of corn skyrocketing, so many hungry people?" And Obama just looks at me and is like, "Oh, yeah, I read that article in Foreign Affairs too. And if you read my campaign proposal carefully, you would have seen that I'm proposing investing in corn-based ethanol as a bridge to cellulosic ethanol, so that we can, make fuel from things like our leaves and grass clippings when you mow the lawn." And he just kind of smiled and walked off. And Olivia looked at me and goes, "You just got schooled by Barack Obama." And both of us signed up to volunteer that evening. And I was like, that was very impressive. I don't know why I thought that I would be able to one up somebody sitting on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, but I tried. So we both signed up for what was supposed to be 2.5 days of campaigning in Iowa. And I ended up staying for about a month and a half because the people who I had met didn't care that he was down 30 points in the polls, didn't necessarily think he was going to win the Iowa caucuses or even become the president-elect. At that time, he wasn't really even a viable candidate. There were just, I think he and Ron Paul were the only two who weren't taking federal lobbyist money. The campaign at the time, I mean, obviously the hindsight of 2021, many people look at that and go, that was considered progressive, but there were a lot of things that were considered, fairly progressive for the time that inspired me. And so I kept volunteering, and then that ended up segueing into a job in the administration. And to your original question, Darnell, yes, I thought it was crazy. But I also thought, I was inspired by my grandparents who marched with Gandhi in the Indian independence movement. Just to be clear for any Republican friends joining, I'm not trying to compare Gandhi to Barack Obama. What I'm saying is the family values that we had were, you should do the right thing, make sacrifices when you can. Basically, it was the mid-'80s version of check your privilege. So I thought if I have an opportunity to serve our country in this particular way, then I should maybe throw my hat in and see if I can do it.
Yeah. So after volunteering, of course, he wins the election, president-elect, and you apply for a position in the White House. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, should I tell the story? Because there are a lot of undergrads too, right?
Well, I mean, it's a cautionary tale. So yeah, I think it's a good story to tell.
I'm going to tell this story because I wish I had known a lot of these things. They do not tell you this in college. I love UCLA, but they do not tell you this kind of stuff. So the campaign ends, right? And it had been about a year a little over a year since I had joined. And Obama becomes the president-elect, and an email goes out from the campaign staff that says, if you've worked on the campaign and you'd like to be considered for a job in the incoming administration, upload your resume to change.gov, which is a website that they had set up to collect resumes. So I did that. I put my resume on change.gov, and I thought, all right, so if I'm qualified for something, somebody will call me, because they know that I worked on the campaign, and they know that the other thousands of people worked on the campaign. And so whatever algorithm they're using, that'll just be good enough. And the only person I told was my manager, my Hollywood manager, the one who is like every character from Entourage. So of course, nobody calls me, and a couple of months go by. And right around the inauguration, I get a phone call saying, well, we'd like you to be part of the inaugural concert on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. They had invited a bunch of actors and musicians to put the concert on. So the perk of that was you got to bring your parents and your couple of close friends backstage into the green room to meet the incoming first family after the concert. So, the president-elect comes through, and he meets my parents and Dan, my manager, and it's very nice. And I'd seen him a bunch, obviously gotten to know him and his staff through the campaign. And then Mrs. Obama comes through, and she says hi to my parents. And then in passing, she just says to me, well, I hope you continue to stay involved. And I said, yeah, I definitely plan on it. I'm thinking that she must say this to everybody that she's shaking hands with. And my manager, who was standing next to me, says, well, he applied for a job, right? And I was like, oh, no, you don't say that. This is not the place where you say that. And she said, well, what do you mean? And he said, yeah, he applied for a job and nobody even called him back. And now I'm just deeply embarrassed. Like, you cannot come into my public service world and do this. This might work in Hollywood. You don't do that.
Hollywood and Washington clash, huh?
Yeah, exactly. I just didn't know what the deal was. And Mrs. Obama looks at me and says, you applied for a job at the White House? Who did you apply with? And that's when the words, I applied on change.gov, came out of my mouth, and realized how ridiculous they sounded, right? And Mrs. Obama looked at me as if I had just dropped a piece of pizza on the floor and ate it in front of her after the 5-second rule. And she called the president-elect over, and she said, come here. And I was like, oh, no, it's okay. He comes over, and she says, Cal, tell him what you just told me. I was like, oh my gosh. So I have to repeat it again. I was like, well, sir, I applied for a job at the White House. And he says, who did you apply with? I was like, oh man, this question again. So I said, look, I applied on change.gov. I thought if I'm qualified for something, somebody will let me know. And he sort of made a joke like, why didn't you just call me, or why didn't you reach out to somebody? And I tell this story in a lot more detail in that chapter, because obviously, yes, it's funny and self-deprecating now that he was a 2-term president. We all know the Obamas. We know their personality. We know that Mrs. Obama has a very low threshold for bullshit. So all of those things. But at the time, the biggest takeaway for me was, if you join, in my case, a campaign, but the same would apply for a company at its relative infancy, and if it grows astronomically, if it achieves a certain success that you were part of the journey, part of the team for, and you want to continue working for that person, that boss, or that company, it's almost disrespectful if you don't let somebody know that, right? And I didn't know that, because as an actor, you have agents and managers who make those initial calls, and then your job is to go to the audition, or the equivalent of an interview, and that's when you kind of crush it. That's when you do your thing. So I was totally naive going into this, not realizing that it might be received as disrespectful, or certainly incredibly naive, that all I did was upload a resume on a website. You're supposed to obviously tap into your networks and go to this was pre-LinkedIn, but look into who you know at LinkedIn and make some phone calls, even if it says don't make phone calls. I didn't know any of that. So I jokingly say I was hazed by Michelle Obama into getting that job, but it also just so happened that they were looking for a staffer to fill 3 specific slots in the public engagement office. They were looking for somebody to work on outreach related to young people, outreach for Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, and then outreach to the arts community. And I happened to work on all of those 3, both in academia when I was teaching classes, and on the campaign, and in my private sector arts job. So it just so happened that ended up working out pretty well. But that's the ridiculous foot in my mouth story about how I actually got the job.
Amazing story. Could we have slide 4, please? So what was it like to take the podium at the 2012 Democratic National Convention and deliver a featured speech?
It was very surreal. I had actually worked. I had worked at the 08, 09, 08, sorry, convention on the floor as a floor whip, as a favor to Paul Tudor, my old boss in Iowa. He was the Obama Iowa State Director. So then cut to 2012 when David Plouffe and Jim Messina had kind of pulled me aside at an event we were doing and said, we'd like you to speak at the DNC. And I thought like on stage or like at a rally outside. They said, no, on stage, we think that you'd have a lot to say. And this was after my 2.5 years serving as the president's liaison to young Americans and Asian Americans at the White House. So I knew exactly what I wanted to say. I wanted to talk about benchmarks to progress. I wanted to talk about why change is so slow, why it's not like a light switch. The things that I had worked on, I was obviously a very small part of huge teams that worked on the Affordable Care Act or the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, or the DREAM Act, which incidentally failed by 5 Democratic votes. And so I knew the stories that I wanted to tell because I had had the privilege of meeting so many people whose lives were affected by either policy proposals or rule changes. But I also didn't. I was really self-conscious that I didn't know how to write a speech for an audience anymore, because the 2.5 years that I was at the White House, the real bureaucratic rules kicked in, and the communications team was really paranoid that anyone in public engagement would speak like a real person. So they would send us talking points and say, you can't stray from these talking points. Otherwise, you might be the news story, and fair, Glenn Beck was running weird, incendiary, made up stories about coworkers of mine who had strayed from remarks on conference calls or at conferences. So the tricky part for me was that I know I sort of do that organically. Like I just talk, I extemporaneously, there's a lot of improv. I couldn't do that in my White House job. And so when it came time to write what was sort of a pseudo-political speech as myself, I was paranoid that I didn't have it anymore. So I sent drafts of the script to John and Hayden, the guys who wrote the Harold and Kumar franchise, other friends who worked both in politics and in entertainment, and was happy with how that came together at the end. But I had not expected the opportunity to write a speech like that.
Well, I love the way you start the speech.
Thank you. With the joke about the madrasa and whether, yeah. Well, so I wanted to, the rare thing that I knew that I could do that not a lot of other people could do was to directly kind of poke fun at what the Republicans were doing, because this was the early stage. Actually, it wasn't the early stages. This was part of the was he born in the United States nonsense and all of the veiled and quite unveiled racism, Islamophobia, xenophobia that was bundled up into what we were hearing. It also came after the RNC. And I had initially approached it thinking, I tried to be respectful. So I'm happy to talk about differences, policy differences between the Republican platform and what we had achieved in the administration. But it seemed like that's not what their convention was about. Their convention was, there were actors who spoke at their convention, and I joke about how like two things Republicans love are guns and Duck Dynasty, and that should not be offensive because they're true. They do love guns. They love Duck Dynasty. The Duck Dynasty dude spoke at the convention. So it was being able to kind of be a little lighter about it, not take it too seriously, not be too precious about the identity politics that I think otherwise, if I were a senator, or if I were an elected official, I could kind of get dragged into. I was able to stay above that fray a little bit, which I enjoyed. So you're talking about the opening of the speech in which, it made one of those jokes.
Yeah, I have to ask, I'm just curious, given your time in Washington and everything you've experienced in Hollywood, what thoughts went through your mind when you saw Kamala Harris take the stage for the first time as the vice president-elect? When she gave a speech, after their, after the win was sort of acknowledged.
Yeah, it was remarkable, and I think it was remarkable for me and a lot of other people in ways that are that both gel with some of my politics and are divorced from some of my politics. The idea that there is a woman who is the vice president who also happens to be biracial, and Anne happens to be Black and Indian, and whose family story is not that different from my family story and how my parents came to America. It's remarkable, and it made me kind of pause for a moment and think, just like my life story of doing things that I never thought would be remotely possible, I certainly never thought I would live to see a moment like that. And I was reminded of that again last week. The vice president posted a photo of the Naval Observatory, their home, lit up for Diwali. And that was another just sort of moment where I just didn't necessarily think that in my lifetime I would see an Indian American vice president who happens to have decorated her house for Diwali. That's so dope. It means, and it's not just for the, hey, let's check the box, let's all say, yeah, we've made it or anything like that. Because to me, that's not what it's about. What it's about is never having seen anything like that growing up, never having, knowing that was part of my American experience, but not having it be part of the mainstream American experience.
It was interesting, the parallels between the speech she made about, little girls sitting and seeing her as a role model up there as vice president is similar to the points you were making about, Indian youth looking at you, your nephews, for example, your cousins. So, I think there's some interesting parallels there in terms of what it means to be seen, in spaces where you don't normally see people who look like you.
I said that because I remember seeing or not seeing people. There's a whole generation, two or three generations actually before mine, of Asian American and South Asian actors who had been working consistently, but for whom there were limited opportunities. So many of them are really strong theater actors. A lot of them have done film and TV in roles that you probably would notice if you saw them. And then of course some household names like Sarita Choudhury from Mississippi Masala, or Ajay Naidu, who is maybe best known for Office Space. There are a lot of actors that just that generation above me who I really have looked up to in the same way. So that's probably what made me think of my younger cousins when I was coming up, was the idea that I knew what that felt like, or didn't know what it felt like.
Sure. So one of the facts that we underscore in our Hollywood Diversity Report series is how dramatically diverse the U.S. population is becoming.
Yeah.
And how diverse audiences are pretty much demanding diverse television and film content. Can we get slide 5, please? So the last Hollywood Diversity Report we released a few weeks ago was based on the 2019-2020 television season. You can see here from this chart that people of color made up about 42.7% of the US population in 2020. And in fact, as you can see, somewhere around 2044 or so, the lines are going to cross and the nation will be majority minority. But despite the progress we've seen in recent years in terms of the on-screen presence of people of color, progress behind the camera has been much slower. For example, though people of color have made some progress as show creators over the years, they still lag significantly in terms of their shares of these all-important positions. Can we get slide 6, please? Here you're looking at show creators by race from the 2011-12 season up to 2019-20. And you see there is some progress, from a low of 4.5% or so when we first started looking at this in the Hollywood Diversity series to what you saw in 2019-20. But again, we're far away from that 42.7% of the population, which is represented by the gray line. Can we see slide 7? We see a similar positive trend in cable, but again, the trend line for people of color lags the population share line, the 42.7% in 2019-20 in cable. And then last but not least, slide 8. And here it is for digital. We first started looking at digital, I believe, in 2013-14, but you can see again, the trend is generally upward, but there's still a huge gap. We're not really closing that gap, and it's been sort of moving pretty slowly. So not only are you an accomplished actor, but you also created a television sitcom, Sunnyside, which aired for a few episodes on NBC in 2019. Slide 9, please. So can you talk to us about this experience? What was it like creating a show like Sunnyside, and what happened to that show once it began to air on NBC?
Sure. Yeah. I had in the first several drafts of the book, I did not include I hadn't written about Sunnyside, and at some point in the process, I realized that that chapter probably sums up, kind of one of the arcs of the narrative that I was telling. So my writing partner Matt Murray, who comes from the world of The Good Place and kind of Mike Schur universe, he and I co-created the show called Sunnyside about a city council member in Sunnyside, Queens, which is one of the most diverse pockets of the country, and it was his sort of. He was a disgraced council member who was rebuilding his life, and one of the ways he did that was by teaching new arrivals to prep for their citizenship test. So that was sort of the backdrop for what was otherwise just a sitcom, a fun story about characters you could relate to. And we enjoyed putting it together. Mike Schur was one of our EPs. We sold it to NBC and Universal. And they were incredibly supportive right out of the gate. I mean, it seemed like they really understood, the creative team there really understood what we were trying to achieve there, which was, wanting to make audiences laugh, wanting it to go to a network so that it was below the digital divide, so that households wherever they were in the country could enjoy this really diverse comedy without having to pay for a subscription. And they got that. They knew, that we wanted the characters to be grounded. So when we hired our casting directors and tried to find our cast, we let them know, please think outside the box. And if we find an incredible actor, we'll write the ethnicity or the background of the character around the comedy, because comedy should come first. So all of that was really, we felt really promising. And the biggest thing I think was that the network really said, we understand that comedy needs to find its audience. It needs a long runway. You need 9 or 10 episodes at least on the air before you can figure out exactly what a show is doing, what the numbers are like. So we all felt really good about that. The weird thing was, I didn't feel like we were seeing a lot of ads for our show, and there were 4 shows that were in the Thursday night comedy block when we got picked up to series. There were 2 new arrivals, ours, which was Sunnyside, and a show called Perfect Harmony, which stars the very funny Bradley Whitford. Also a very funny show, but far less diverse just because of the nature of what that plot line was. And coming into our season, we realized a couple things. One, we were the most diverse show in the history of network television in terms of the cast, which was incredible and a really great feeling. Matt especially had put in so much work into making sure that our writer's room was also the most diverse writer's room to date in the history of network TV. And the way that he did that was similar to how we cast it: comedy first, everything else second. But, to your point, Darnell, about how people generally get jobs in the entertainment industry, or to be fair, any sort of insular industry, it was up to us to say to agents and to say to managers, don't just send us the same 5 people who you send because they make you the most money. Who are your new voices? Who are your emerging voices? Where can we find writers who haven't really been tapped before? So our entire writer's room was either all immigrants or the first family members of immigrants. There was a huge LGBT contingent overlapped on top of all of that between the cast and the writing team. Excuse me. All of which is to say, when we launched, we felt like we were in a great place. We felt very supported by the network, despite not feeling like we were seeing ads. But I got to tell you, and for anybody on here who's creative, actors are crazy, writers are crazy. Like, the side of us that makes us creative also makes us completely insane. So I chalked it up to, you're a crazy show creator. There are commercials out there. There are billboards out there. Just because you're not seeing them doesn't mean they don't exist. And our first episode aired, and it was the worst rated episode of a network TV show in the history of network TV. So not only were we the most diverse, we were also the worst rated. And that was really hard to take, but the network called immediately and said, please don't worry. If you remember, we told you comedies really require a long runway. People will discover the show. And that turned out not to be the case. So by the 3rd episode airing, they had already made the decision that they were going to pull it off the air. And the chapter in which I talk about this is, for those of you who are deadline nerds or really want to know about kind of the business of how all that comes together, that's all in there in a lot more detail. But essentially, it ended with us being on a conference call, Matt and I, with some of the executives at NBC. And there's an executive in particular who kept saying to us, we're not canceling the show. we're moving it from linear to digital. And we said, what does that mean? Is it going to end up on Peacock? Is it on a streaming service? We're airing on Hulu. Does it stay on Hulu? And they just kept saying, we don't know, but we're just letting you know we're not canceling it. And it sounded a little dog whistly. It sounded a little, they were saying something without saying it. And finally I said, I don't understand. Are you moving us to NBC.com? Because that's what it sounds like. And they said, yes, we're moving you to NBC.com. But we're putting full resources behind it. I mean, the same BS that they had said before, right? Which is, of course, not unique. This happens at networks. It's a business they're running. But they kept saying the same thing. We have your back. Comedies have a long runway. They really need to find their audience. And I just said, I just need to know what resources, because we haven't seen that you're putting any resources behind our particular show. And that's when they lost it. And they said, we can cancel your show right now. We can pull it off the air. We can pull it off of digital. A lot of yelling and screaming, not unlike Fox News or MSNBC on that phone call. And I've worked enough in politics and in Hollywood to know when I should take a step back and realize that the person who's yelling at me is incapable of having a professional conversation. So I sort of left it at that, and it was a bummer. But a couple of days later, we realized what they were probably referring to. So Ad Age, which is the advertising industry publication, sort of like a Hollywood Reporter for the ad industry, they ran an article disaggregating the data between Sunnyside and Perfect Harmony, the other new show that was on the same night. And they found that NBC had spent roughly 3,300% more on Perfect Harmony than they had on Sunnyside in terms of their ad spend and their advertising placement. So it wasn't just paranoia that made us think that we weren't seeing ads that were on par. They were actually investing 3,300% less in our show. But the biggest takeaway from that for us was, networks use Nielsen ratings to measure the success or failure of shows. And so you can't simultaneously use the same benchmark of success, a Nielsen rating, if you're investing disproportionately based on whether a show is a show of color or if it's a predominantly white show, because in so doing, you're setting up the people of color show to fail. And that's pretty much one of the definitions of systemic racism. So the reason that I chose to tell that story in the book in far more detail than I just did here is not just because I have a chip on my shoulder, although to be fair, this was like 2 years ago. Obviously, part of it is still very raw. But the reason is because networks are sort of in this archaic mode of how they do business. They're still advertising driven. There's still a big chasm between development executives who may have the best of intentions in bringing on talent of color, and then the business execution that excludes that talent of color and doesn't support them, not just at the level, but at any level, and sets them up to fail. And they're competing against a streaming platform or streaming markets that aren't ad driven, that are subscription driven. And for those of us who thought naively, let's pitch a show that's going to live below the digital divide, most American consumers don't get their media in that way anymore. I mean, think about when was the last time you actually stopped to watch live TV that wasn't a sporting event or an awards show, right? It just doesn't happen anymore. So for me, it was a big learning experience in my own naivete and the types of stories that I wanted to tell. But the silver lining to that was the industry is changing so rapidly. I love it so much. I want to continue to make shows like the one that you just showed the poster for. And I think there's a real way to do that. So that was the deep dive that kind of wrapped up the book, exactly what happened. I'm actually curious. I mean, we can talk offline depending on how much time we have, but I'm so curious, the data points that you put up on the majority minority and kind of how the industry changes and the showrunners. We talk about this a lot because the majority minority still means that the majority is white, right? It still means that the majority group, if you're taking a singular group,
Plurality group, you mean?
I'm sorry, the plurality group, yeah.
Right.
And so I'm curious how that ends up affecting diversity even after we pass that 2040 or 2050 point. Where
Sure. Well, I mean, I think a lot of what we're seeing nationally now on the political stage is related to that demographic change and people trying to hold on to certain types of privilege. Certainly in Hollywood, I think the example, and the reason I love the Sunnyside example so much is that I think it illustrates quite nicely the way the industry is trying to continue to do business the way it's always done it, despite the fact the market's changing. And I think you pointed to streaming. Streaming is changing everything, and it's created opportunities for shows that we would have never seen on broadcast because, again, they don't care about the ratings as much as they care about subscriptions. One of the things I find telling about this case, in addition to what you found from the Ad Age article about the differences in marketing dollars put behind your show versus the other show, is really the relatively minor differences in the ratings. One of the things we know for sure about broadcast television is ratings have been declining quite, dramatically in recent years because of the proliferation of channels and shows and binge watching and streaming and that type of thing. So, I mean, these fine distinctions, determining whether something survives or not is pretty telling. Then, of course, the show they replaced your show with didn't do much better, did it?
It didn't. Our show had I think we debuted at a 0.4, which is not good for anybody who knows ratings. It's not great. Perfect Harmony, I think, debuted at a 0.5. We had dropped to a 0.3. They dropped to a 0.4. So one of the things that I do talk about is, if you've invested 3,300% less in a show that has people of color, and that show only has a 0.1 lower rating than the show you invested 3,300% more in, isn't that lower rated show more successful? Because with almost no resources, didn't it overperform? And obviously the argument could be made in a number of different ways, but that was the big takeaway for us and the cast and the creative executive team was, wow, they're really kind of trying to make something go away that could have a second life somewhere with the right resources. And that, of course, calls into question, are networks doing this just so they can show face, like, oh, we tried it and it didn't work? Right. Or is it far more innocent than that, where there are just different departments who just are looking at old, archaic ways of doing business, to your point, Darnell? Our show was replaced in the time slot by Will and Grace, which is, of course, an all-white show that's really a relic from the 90s. No disrespect to that cast, who are obviously very funny, but the Joel Kim Booster, who's one of our cast members, sent a series of really funny tweets for anybody who's interested in the office politics of what networks do and don't want their casts to say. I think you'll enjoy the lighter part of that chapter, which is all of Joel's tweets that he kindly gave us permission to use in the book. But one of the things that he said was he was really pissed off when they found out that we were being pulled off the air and Will and Grace was replacing us. Incidentally, that decision was made on Columbus Day. He talks about, he's a stand-up comedian, so he talked about it in his tweets. But the big takeaway from that was that Will and Grace, at its lowest point, dipped to basically a 0.4, which was our initial rating for Sunnyside. And as you might expect, Will and Grace was not pulled off the air by NBC. So there were just a number of things that you could point to say this is kind of how networks remain archaic when you have streaming platforms that have popped up. And also, to be fair, some of the frustrations for content creators of color.
And the other thing too is, our studies show, and they've shown this consistently over the years, that TV shows, all things equal, that have casts that look more like America do the best in terms of their ratings, and that's been a pretty consistent finding. So yeah, I mean, a lot of the issues that we continue to confront in Hollywood are based on choices that are rooted in practices that just don't align with the realities of today. Well, we're well past the 6 o'clock hour, and I could go on forever. I still have questions I'd love to ask you, but I want to give our audience a chance to kind of get in on this. So we have a question here from the audience. It says that you were the RA in our dorms back at UCLA. My roommate and I, both of us South Asian, had a poster of Apu from The Simpsons up in our dorms. And I remember you trying to explain to us why the character was so problematic. What role do you think that long-running shows like The Simpsons have in updating characters and moving the conversation on diversity forward?
It's such an interesting question. And I know, even within the South Asian community, people have differing views on Apu. My view on Apu was framed by kids in middle school. When I would get bullied, it was accompanied with quotes from The Simpsons, or it was accompanied with quotes from Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. So from a younger age, I was mindful of the fact that the images that we were seeing impact the things that bullies do, for example. Would I have been bullied if those shows were not on the air? Obviously. I'm not suggesting that that's the reason that I was bullied. But it adds a certain layer, right, that makes you think, oh, this is how people get these ideas in their head about what they're seeing. There's been such an interesting conversation about Apu in a way that was, I thought, a little disappointing and reductionist, although not surprising if you look at kind of who makes those shows. But I would have liked to have seen him stay on The Simpsons with a little more nuance. You know, the issue has always been, and I do write about this actually in one of the footnotes. Darnell, you mentioned all the footnotes. There's a lengthy footnote about The Simpsons and kind of explaining how the argument of, well, it's just a cartoon. Of course, it's just a cartoon. But we know the yellow characters are meant to be white, and we know that the apple character is meant to be Indian. And so, if you're looking at the normalization of those characters, which ones are flawed, which ones are fully fleshed out, which ones are reductionist, I don't think that inherently a guy who runs a convenience store on its own is a stereotype. There are plenty of people who do run those types of stores. It's just that you're not seeing the full breadth of a particular type of community. The kids have accents for some reason.
It's the reduction. It's the reduction. Yeah.
And so, in reframing those conversations, I'm not a big fan of let's erase this and pretend it never happened. It's obviously a case by case basis, but a show like that, the writing, they're very talented writers. They're all Harvard guys. I'm sure they could have come up with a fix if they really wanted to, but sometimes it's easier from their perspective than not. It's an interesting one. By the way, I'm so curious if you still have that poster of Apu on your wall.
So we have another question here. We were talking about this a little bit earlier as we were prepping for the event tonight. How did you get Cardi B to officiate your wedding?
And so she has not yet. This has all just been Twitter banter, but she was on a flight that I was on 6 a.m. from New York to LA for part of this book promo, and I realized she was on the plane. I'm like, Cardi B is on our flight, and I fell asleep. I didn't want to bother her. Fell asleep and had this dream that she officiated the wedding. Myself, my fiance Josh, did it on the plane. And part of the dream was that the three of us held hands walking out of LAX. I thought it was so ridiculous that I tweeted it. I did not tag her in the tweet because I thought that might be a little tacky. But she saw the tweet somehow and replied to us and said that she'd be happy to officiate the wedding. So I'd like to take her up on that. I feel like the biggest danger here, it's not a danger. I'm actually really looking forward to it. The thing I'm probably looking forward to the most is Cardi explaining her lyrics to the aunties and uncles who come to the wedding. I think that'll be the biggest.
By the way, I love your explanation of the role of aunties and uncles in Indian culture.
Oh, yeah.
In the community. I love that in the book. It's great.
Thank you. It was. I wanted to be fair about it. That for when you're an American-born kid growing up, it can feel like a lot of pressure, and then from the parents' perspective, especially the generation that my parents are from, that post-65 moving to America to fill a labor shortage. From their perspective, 10 aunties and uncles giving you advice is like, what an amazing opportunity you have to feel supported, unless you're not doing the thing that they are giving you advice on. So try to be fair about that.
So we have another question here. How did you decide to become a sociology major, and how did you decide where to go career-wise post-graduation? Well, some of that was sort of, you came to LA with, the idea of wanting to get into, acting and so forth, but where did the sociology part come in?
So the sociology part was that I really wanted to double major in the School of Theater, Film, and Television and in something outside of the school, and that in this case, sociology, because I felt like a lot of the social classes I was taking were really feeding my interest and making me stronger as an actor, making my mind a little more diverse in the things that I knew about. And I don't know who runs it now, but the undergrad theater, film, and television guidance counselor was not very solid. And she didn't really make you meet with her all that often. So I decided I was just going to take enough classes to get a double major, even though you weren't allowed to double major if you were a theater major. So I just thought, well, once I have all those credits, I'll just fill out the petition and then I'll meet with her. And they're supposed to check what you're doing, right? So I guess it was my fourth year, I went to her with this petition and I said, I'd like you to sign off on my double major. And she said, oh, you're not allowed to double major in the School of Theater, Film, and Television. I said, yeah, I know that, but I did it. So I just need you to sign the paper. And she says, well, I can't sign it because you're not allowed to. I'm like, oh my God, this is such a UCLA bureaucracy conversation. I'm explaining to you that I already did it. So all you have to do is sign the piece of paper. Well, I'm not allowed to sign the piece of paper because you're not allowed to do it. I already did it. So it was that over and over again. And then I finally just said, all right, I know she's not going to sign this paper. Sociology lets you declare a concentration in anything you want. So I walked in sociology with a concentration in theater, film, and television. But apparently you can just tell people whatever you want about what you majored in. So I was technically a sociology major, but I have no shame in telling people that technically I also could have been a double major in theater, film, television, sociology.
All right, mystery solved. So more than ever, there's another question here. More than ever, there are movies and programming being imported from other countries. Is there a danger that Hollywood will see foreign imports as a shortcut to diversity?
That's such an interesting question. I don't think so. I mean, Darnell, you tell me. I mean, how do you? I guess it depends on how you tabulate the data and whether you're like for your streaming, especially. Are you considering Amazon and?
Yeah, well, we only look at quote unquote American-made projects. I mean, well, U.S. and Canada. I mean, those markets can overlap. We don't look at foreign language. If a company is a US-based company, but the location is somewhere else in the world, we count that too. I mean, what we're trying to do really is to get a handle on sort of the degree to which the US population is reflected in the workforce and in the images that circulate. So we wouldn't count a foreign language film that was created someplace else in our diversity data. But I think this question is getting at whether the industry itself would sort of sidestep its responsibility to produce diverse programming in lieu of something that may be produced somewhere else and try to market it here in the States as well. We haven't seen signs of that, but I'm just curious to see whether it's something you've thought about.
No, I haven't really seen that either. I mean, I think it's pretty transparent when there's a foreign show that, I mean, look at, what the number one show on Netflix right now. I mean, there's no secret on where it's from, or nobody's trying to cover.
See, we wouldn't have counted that in our data, even though Squid Games is, a phenomenon, a global phenomenon. But we
exactly. So I haven't experienced that.
So another question. Former co-star John Cho was able to participate in the world of Star Trek. What can we do to help you land in the Star Wars universe?
Oh man, love to be in the Star Wars universe. I don't know how that happens. I mean, what was his amazing? I loved seeing that the hashtag Cast John Cho. Was it Cast John Cho? I participated in because he is like a brother to me. By the way, for Harold and Kumar fans, you can learn how and why John is such a talented farter. Chapter, but he's such a smart guy. We're both avid readers. It's one of the reasons we knew about, or I had heard about Jhumpa Lahiri's novels and her writing that led into The Namesake. I'm not trying to sidestep that question at all. I don't know. I would love to be in not just the Star Wars universe, but I had a very small part. It ended up getting cut out, but I had a tiny part in Superman Returns, for example, which was a blast because I'm a big fan of comic book movies. Any of those escapism, big budget things, super down. So if you all have ideas on how to get cast in those, let me know.
Maybe we can start a Cal Penn for Star Wars campaign or something.
I'm not going to say no.
All right. Actually, here's a question that I would have asked if I had more time, but I'm glad someone from the audience brought this up. Being Indian and from an immigrant culture, were you expected to be a doctor, lawyer, engineer? How did you get your parents to buy in to support your chosen path? Or if they didn't, when was the switch where they felt like you made it?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yes, look, when my parents and their friends came here post 1965 to fill a labor shortage. There weren't enough American-born doctors, engineers, and many other professions. So my dad was able to come to America to pursue a graduate degree in engineering. My mom has a master's in chemistry. I am, I joke, I am a disappointment as an actor who can't do math and is interested in but bad at science. I think for them, and really it wasn't just, my parents, there was a little bit of tacit support as I was trying to pursue acting. And I try to be as mindful of that as possible because they were certainly supportive at different times. But the community as a whole was not supportive at all. And it wasn't just the generation of my parents that I found to be unsupportive at a particular age, but even at UCLA, I remember during orientation signing up for the Indian Student Union mailing list outside of Kirkhoff on Bruin Walk, actually, at a table. And the woman who was, I guess second or third year said, "Where are you from? What are you majoring in?" I said, "I'm from New Jersey. I'm a theater and film major." And she laughed and said, "No, really, what are you majoring in?" And to be fair, I was the only brown kid undergrad who was a theater major, right? So I said, no, really, I'm a theater major. I'm really excited about it. And her laugh turned to like this stone cold, what I call like a junior auntie stare. And moved on to the next person behind me and said, "Hey, where are you from? What are you majoring in?" And I never got added to that email list. And there were brown kids on my dorm in Reber on my floor who would go out of their way to say things like, why aren't you a South Campus major? You're such a sellout. Things that I just couldn't quite place. Why did my peers feel this way? Why were they assigning certain cultural traits to a major or a profession? I'm sure if there are any psych students here, they can help me dissect what that was all about. But one of the things that I think is still really important and has thankfully changed so much is that there used to be almost no support from within the community, and I think that was one of the big reasons why change was relatively slow. We weren't encouraging other Asian Americans or other South Asians to become writers or executives or casting directors or directors. That's thankfully changed so much, and you see the fruits of those changes are that there are so many Mindy Kalings and Hasan Minhajes and folks out there that are really doing the thing. But there was no aha moment, to answer the other part of that question, from my parents, I don't think. I mean, up until House, I still remember getting emails from my parents saying, like, at least get a real estate license. Like, what's your going to be? It went from at least go to law school to like at least get a real estate license. And then like, okay, you actually have a job every day that you go to at a studio where you're playing a doctor. Okay then.
Okay. Here's another question. Has your connection to cannabis via Kumar stifled your career in any way, or did it have any influence on it?
I don't think it affected it one way or the other. I mean, I think most people know that, a movie is a movie. And if anything, and even I don't know if this was a reference to my political career, but even working on the Obama campaign, working in the White House, everybody sort of knows, those are movies. They're fun. I intend to make many more of them if I have the opportunity. And I think, people know when there's a time to be serious and a time to kind of be funny. The only time it ever overlapped was, when you work in government, you have to go through a background check, and you have to tell the FBI if you've ever smoked weed, or if there's ever any weed related or drug related thing in your life. So I was like, I did 2 movies about marijuana, and the guys are like across from me at the table. They're trying to stifle a laugh. They're like, yes, we know. Like, oh, okay. I just in case that affects whether I get my security clearance. Like, it does not. Good. That's good to know. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, here's a closely related question, actually. What was the hardest part about transitioning to a political career? Specifically, did people have a hard time sort of distinguishing between who you were as a political staffer and your role as an actor in films like Harold and Kumar?
No, thankfully not. I think part of this is because of the nature of the campaign that I worked on and when I joined. I joined coming out of the summer when Obama was down 30 points in the polls against Clinton and John Edwards. So when you work at that level, you're really working with, you get to know the candidate very well, you get to know the senior advisors, you're doing real work on the ground. And if the campaign does well, you're getting more and more responsibilities as those concentric circles kind of increase. And then working at the White House also, the working as Obama's liaison to young Americans meant that I was meeting with young people on his behalf every day. And for all of the nonsense that the news will try to cover college students or college age students, the reality is if you're 18 to 26 and you have the opportunity to meet with somebody who's representing the White House, no matter what that administration is or what your beliefs are, you're probably going to want to talk about what the actual issues are, no matter who it is that you're meeting with. And that was so there were a lot of, I didn't do a lot of press around my job. I wasn't part of the communications team. Whenever it did come up, it was like, okay, People Magazine writing some salacious article about, does Kalpen get asked about weed all the time? Fair question if that's what you're wondering, but the reality is I wish they instead would have written an article about how incredible young organizers are and how they're pushing for the DREAM Act or how they're pushing for, doubling the Pell Grant or meaningful financial aid reform. Because those were my meetings that I was having every day. So were there like 1 out of 100 times when people would have a question about a movie, yeah, of course, but for the most part, no, it just was never part of that.
Great. And this is probably appropriate for our last question as we wrap things up. What advice and lessons learned would you provide to a first-year student at UCLA today with goals to follow in your footsteps?
Oh man, I thought about this recently because somebody also asked me in connection to the book, and I didn't necessarily think it was. I mean, I wrote this book for the like I said, the 20-year-old version of me, and for the person who's told that things you want to do in life are crazy. But I was ill prepared to answer this, so I'm glad I remembered this woman. It was while I was at UCLA. I think it was a combination of a UCLA event and something the Screen Actors Guild was putting on. But there was a moderated conversation, sort of like this one, with an actor who, if I recall correctly, was the only Black actor on network TV at the time. And I can't remember what show she was on. But one of the questions in the audience was, how do you deal with rejection? And how do you deal with knowing that you're not going to get certain parts because of the color of your skin when your peers are going to be able to shine? And I'm going to be paraphrasing badly since it's been so many years, but she essentially said that she tries to go in and be as prepared as possible. She said she was classically trained. You know, she had training in Shakespeare. I think she had her MFA from Yale or something like that, some elite drama school that she got into. She said, I know that when I go into audition for a part, the casting director, the producers, the executives, they all know my resume. They know that I've got all these things under my belt. And so at the end of the day, if they want to cast, Karen from Iowa, who doesn't have any of those credits and doesn't have anything on her resume because she gave a great audition and they just feel like that's a safer choice, I know that they know that they passed me up because of the color of my skin. I know that they know that I was more qualified than she was. So, and I know that going in there, I have to be 1,000% more qualified than the person I'm up against. That's just the reality. The reason that was such a takeaway for me was that through the story I told you about my friend Jenna and her manager saying that a guy like him will never work in Hollywood, I was carrying around so much anger and I was going to auditions so angry all the time. And I would go on auditions thinking, there were so many Sabrina the Teenage Witch examples that if I ever had one for like a guy named Dave from the Valley, I would automatically think there's no way I'm getting this part. And I was so angry that I would even go to the audition. Like, why am I even bothering? There was so much anger that I was carrying around that hearing this woman talk about, just acknowledge out in the open, she knew she had to work 1,000 times harder. She needed the credits on her resume. She had the training on her resume, and she was going to put that energy towards proving people wrong was something that I didn't even think that I had that option. I didn't think I had that agency. And so hearing that from her made me feel a lot more grounded, and it made me kind of channel my energy towards things that were a lot more helpful at the time.
Yeah, that's a wonderful anecdote. I really appreciate that in the memoir as well. Well, we're right about at 6:30.
And let me just say, I had missed this. There are like 62 questions that we have not gotten to. This evening, I put up on my Instagram a Q&A. I'm happy to get to some of these over the next 24 hours if you all want to drop them on the Q&A. I'm happy to try.
Great. Well, we'll see if we can't get those over to your Instagram account so that you can respond to the questions. But anyway, Cal, I just really want to thank you for sharing with us this evening your experiences in Hollywood, in Washington. I personally learned a lot from your memoir, and a lot of it for me, resonates very closely with what I study. So I really appreciate it on that level. And I'm sure our students got a lot of this as well in terms of your experiences at UCLA and how you were able to turn that into an amazing career, again, both in Washington, in Hollywood, and beyond. So thanks again. And hopefully, you won't be a stranger to UCLA, and we'll actually see you in person at some point, once we're beyond the pandemic.
Yeah, I hope to see you in person. I want to give a huge shout out to the whole Bruin community, especially so many of you who have given me so much love already on the book. Had a lot of people actually ask for any of the educators or people who are doing book clubs, shoot me a note. I would be happy to do one of these if you're assigning a chapter in your class, or if it's helpful in anything that you're doing. Part of the reason I'm excited to share my story is that I wish there was a book like this when I was at UCLA. So thanks for this incredible conversation, Darnell. I continue to be in awe and very thankful for the work that you and the whole team do, both on the diversity report and all of the other stuff that you're researching and kind of putting out there. It helps those of us who are artists and it's irreplaceable. So thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Cal. Well, thank you to the audience as well for joining us this evening. Be safe, and we'll see you at the next Dean Salon.